I went to my ex's funeral. People were whispering, then the lawyer read the will, and everyone stared at me like I. Can you believe it? The air in that church, it shifted the moment I walked in. Every single eye was on me, whispering my name like it was a curse. I mean, it had been over a decade since most of them had even seen me, and there I was, standing at my ex-husband's funeral like some kind of storm they never saw coming. And let me tell you the real story? It was just about to begin. Martin Devlin, the man I once called my husband, was lying there in an open casket, surrounded by white roses and the softest, saddest music. His second wife, Tina, was front and center, dabbing her eyes with a tissue she barely even used. My daughters, Jenna and Harper, were right beside her, both of them actively avoiding my gaze, like I was a ghost or something. I knew I wasn't welcome. I knew that space hadn't been mine for a long, long time. But honestly, I didn't come for them. I didn't come to make a scene. I came because, despite everything he had done, Martin had once been my whole world. And part of me, maybe the strongest part, just needed to see this through, to mark the absolute end of it all. As I walked slowly down the side aisle, people leaned into each other, whispering. I caught fragments. Is that her? After all these years? Why would she even come? I didn't flinch. Not even a little. I kept my head high, my back ramrod straight, and chose a pew way in the back, quietly folding my coat beside me. It felt like I was on trial, but I wasn't ashamed. They didn't know the whole story. Most people never do. The minister spoke, people cried, and all these memories I'd long buried came rushing back. Our first Christmas. That little house in Charleston. The girls learning to ride their bikes in the backyard. And then, the silence. That thick, suffocating silence that settled between us in our last years together. Then, just when I thought the whispers might finally die down, the lawyer stood at the podium. Tall man, charcoal suit, briefcase in hand. His voice was calm, but crystal clear. I've been asked to read a section of Martin Devlin's last will and testament, he said. There was this pause, long enough to tense every single shoulder in that room. He flipped open his folder, cleared his throat, and then he read it. To Leona Markham. Heads turned in unison. Every single pair of eyes, including my daughter's, locked onto me. No one spoke. No one even blinked. And in that frozen moment, I finally understood. The real story? It was only just beginning. Before betrayal rewrote my name into whispers and judgment, I was simply Leona. A wife. A mother. A woman who genuinely believed in building a life, not chasing one. Martin and I were married for 25 years, and for most of that time, I truly believed we had something steady, something sacred. We met in our late 20s. I was an art student, paint on my hands, dreams in my pockets. He was a freshly minted business graduate, just brimming with ambition. His world was sharp corners and hard decisions. Mine was messy and full of color. We balanced each other, or at least, that's what I thought. We married in a modest ceremony one spring afternoon in Charleston. The church was tiny, the cake was store-bought, but we laughed like kids building castles out of sand. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment above a bookstore. I painted while Martin built his financial consulting business from our kitchen table. We lived on ramen noodles and huge dreams, always promising each other that one day, things would be easier. And they were. Eventually. Martin's business took off. Clients came, and so did the money. He started wearing suits that cost more than our rent in those early years. I stayed home, raising our daughters, Jenna and Harper, while still painting on the side, mostly as gifts, sometimes for neighbors, and often just to remember who I was, you know? Our home in Charleston was something I had helped design. The garden out back bloomed with hydrangeas because I just loved how wild they grew. The walls were painted in calming earth tones, and every corner had a piece of our life. Baby photos, handprint paintings, Martin's first business award, that little clay dog Harper made in 2nd grade. We weren't flashy. We were rooted. For years, my life truly revolved around my family. I drove the girls to school, made homemade lunches, hosted PTA meetings. I taught them how to bake, how to apologize sincerely, and how to stand up for themselves. When Martin came home late, I made sure dinner was still warm. When he traveled, I tucked handwritten notes into his luggage. He didn't always notice, but I didn't do it for praise. I did it because I loved him. Because we were building something together. Looking back now, I can see the imbalance that lived quietly beneath it all. Martin was the face of our family's success, the one people saw. I was the foundation, the unseen spine. And I honestly didn't mind. I was never hungry for recognition. I believed in partnership, not performance. Our daughters grew, and so did Martin's business. We upgraded from a modest sedan to 2 luxury cars, took family vacations, Paris, Costa Rica, even a cruise to Alaska. On the outside, we were a portrait of success. Neighbors envied us, friends asked for advice, and I, in my quiet way, was so proud of the life we had made. But now, I wonder if I confused comfort for connection. Martin had become more distant, yet I filled the gaps with understanding. I told myself he's just stressed, or it's a busy season, or he's doing all this for us. The truth is, I didn't want to admit what I saw, that the man I married was slowly becoming someone I didn't recognize. And worse, someone who no longer saw me at all. Still, there were no screaming matches, no threats of leaving. Just a soft, creeping silence that settled between us like dust on forgotten shelves. I'd ask about his day and he'd answer with a nod. I'd show him a new painting and he'd glance, say nice, and return to his laptop. He wasn't cruel. He was absent. Present in body, but somewhere else entirely in mind. But even then, I didn't think we were broken. I believed this was just a season, a dry patch that all marriages hit. I told myself that love was quiet sometimes, that maybe after so many years, comfort was enough. I held on to that belief like a lifeline. I thought we were safe. I thought we'd made it through the hard parts. I didn't know that while I was tending the garden, Martin was already halfway out the door. The first real sign that something was wrong didn't come in the form of an argument or a slammed door. It came wrapped in linen and wine, on a night meant to celebrate Martin's latest business award. We had been invited to a formal gala downtown, the kind with string quartets, past hors d'oeuvres, and ice sculptures carved into company logos. Martin was receiving a leadership award for outstanding entrepreneurial excellence, and I had spent the entire afternoon preparing for it. I wore a midnight blue dress he had complimented years earlier, paired with the silver necklace he gave me on our 20th anniversary. I even styled my hair the way he liked it, soft curls, not too much spray. I just wanted to look elegant, not for anyone else, just for him. When we arrived, Martin immediately separated from me. I told myself it was because he needed to shake hands and network. It was his night, after all. I hovered near the bar with a glass of white wine, smiling politely at strangers, watching him from a distance as he laughed, clapped backs, made toasts. He was magnetic in rooms like that. Everyone gravitated toward him, and I didn't mind being in the background. I never had. But then it happened. An executive from a partner firm came over to introduce himself to Martin, who was standing nearby with a few colleagues. I moved closer, smiling, ready to extend my hand. That's when Martin gestured toward me, so casually, and said, "Oh, and that's Leona. She keeps me sane." He said it with a chuckle, like it was an inside joke. The group laughed. I laughed too, though I didn't feel it. My hand, mid-gesture, floated awkwardly for a second before returning to my side. She keeps me sane. Not my wife. Not the woman who supported me from day one. Not even my better half. Just someone who kept him from going crazy. Like a therapist. Or a houseplant. It was a small thing, a passing remark in a noisy ballroom, but it landed like a stone in my stomach. The rest of the evening, I smiled through it. I clinked glasses, posed for photos, and applauded as he gave his acceptance speech. He thanked his team, his mentors, his late father. He never once mentioned me. I told myself it wasn't personal, that he simply forgot, that maybe he thought acknowledging me in such a professional setting would seem off-topic. But even as I rationalized it, I felt the warmth leave my chest. On the drive home, I wanted to say something, not to accuse, but to understand. I turned to him at a red light and asked gently, "Did you mean what you said tonight, about me just keeping you sane?" He didn't even look over. He was scrolling through congratulatory texts on his phone. "It was just a joke," he said. "Don't be so sensitive." Sensitive. That word had started to follow me around like a shadow. Anytime I brought up something that hurt, something that made me feel invisible or dismissed, I was sensitive. It was his shield, the way he deflected without engaging. And every time he used it, I shrank a little smaller inside myself. The days after the gala were quiet. He returned to work. I returned to the rhythm of home, laundry, groceries, tidying up. But something had shifted. I stopped waiting at the window when he worked late. I stopped cooking elaborate dinners. I stopped asking about his day. Instead, I started noticing. Not big, obvious things, but little ones. His cologne changed. He started dressing sharper, even for casual errands. His phone never left his side. He laughed more with clients on calls than he did with me at the dinner table. Still, I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't want to be the paranoid wife. I just told myself it was a phase, a busy season, a dry patch. We'd been through worse. But I couldn't forget that night, that small moment, that offhand comment that told me no, warned me, that I was no longer at the center of his world. I just didn't realize yet that I'd already been replaced. After that gala night, it was like something shifted in the very walls of our home. Not visibly, not violently, but slowly, like a house settling wrong on its foundation. From the outside, we were the same. We still had our routines, we still shared a bed, we still had dinner together most nights. But underneath, something essential had gone silent. Martin started coming home later. Sometimes he didn't come home at all, claiming client dinners, late meetings, or overnight business trips that popped up with no warning. I stopped asking for details. Each time I did, he'd sigh and say, "It's work, Leona. You know how it is." But I didn't. I used to know his work. I used to help him with early drafts of presentations, sit in the back row during his speeches, even iron his shirts before he pitched to investors. Now, I wasn't part of that world. I wasn't invited. He no longer needed me in the spaces he once built with me. One evening, I made his favorite lemon herb chicken with roasted carrots and garlic mashed potatoes. I lit candles. Even opened a bottle of red. It was our anniversary. 30 years. He didn't come home. No call, no text, nothing. I waited until midnight. The food went cold, the candles burned low. I blew them out one by one, sat at the edge of our bed in my best dress, and stared at the door like a fool. The next morning, he walked in at 7 a.m., wearing the same clothes he'd left in the day before. No apology. Just a casual, "Didn't you see my message?" I had to crash at the hotel last minute, dinner ran long. There was no message. I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded, walked into the kitchen, and poured his coffee the way he liked it. No sugar, a splash of cream. That's what it became. Quiet surrender. Not because I was weak, but because I was tired. Tired of chasing scraps of affection, tired of explaining my hurt only to be met with eye rolls or indifference. Every time I tried to express myself, he made me feel like I was unstable, a woman unraveling over nothing. He began making little digs in front of the girls at dinner. One night, Harper mentioned wanting to take a gap year before college, and I encouraged her to explore what made her happy. Martin laughed. "You see what happens when kids spend too much time with their mother and not enough with structure." Jenna chuckled. Harper looked uncomfortable. I stayed quiet. I was losing them too. The girls, once my shadow and joy, had grown closer to Martin. Maybe because he had become the fun parent, the one who took them on ski trips and bought them the latest phones. I was the one reminding them to eat vegetables and finish homework. They didn't see how distant he was with me. They didn't hear how he shut me down when no one else was around. To them, I was just moody, overly emotional, always tired. He started spending weekends out of town for business, and when he was home, he was glued to his phone. I tried to talk to him, and he'd reply without looking up. My words bounced off him like dull noise. It wasn't just the big moments he missed. It was the 1,000 tiny ones. The way he no longer touched me in passing, the way he stopped saying goodnight, the way he forgot I had started teaching art classes at the community center. He didn't ask how they were going. He didn't ask anything about me at all. Sometimes, I would sit on the edge of the bathtub and cry silently into a towel so no one would hear. Not because he yelled, he never raised his voice. It was worse than that. He erased me. Slowly, expertly, until I began to question whether I was ever really seen to begin with. I'd stare at my reflection and wonder, when did I stop being his person? When did I stop being a person at all? And still I stayed. Because I believed in vows. Because I believed in seasons. Because I told myself that if I just tried harder, he'd come back. But love isn't something you can carry alone, and I was already carrying everything. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that should have felt sacred, or at the very least, ordinary. We were hosting a small backyard brunch for Jenna's engagement. Nothing extravagant, just close friends, a few family members, finger foods, and champagne flutes clinking under the soft jazz music playing from the patio speaker. I had spent the entire week preparing, polishing silver, setting the outdoor table with care, arranging fresh flowers from the market. It was the kind of thing I used to love, not because I enjoyed being the hostess, but because it made people feel seen, celebrated. I believed that joy was in the details. Martin hadn't offered to help, but I didn't ask. By then, I had stopped expecting him to notice the labor it took to make something beautiful. He showed up that morning in khakis and a navy button-down, freshly shaved, smiling like he hadn't missed every other dinner that month. Jenna hugged him tightly, glowing with excitement, and I caught a glimpse of the father she always adored. Harper arrived shortly after, quieter, always watching. I busied myself in the kitchen, carrying out fruit platters and mini quiches. I laughed when prompted, mingled as expected, and avoided hovering too close to Martin. We had perfected the art of coexisting without connection. But what I wasn't prepared for was what came next, and how effortlessly it would slice through what little dignity I had left. Toward the end of the afternoon, someone tapped a glass to give a toast. It was Daniel, Jenna's fiancé, a sweet, nervous young man who adored her. He said a few kind words about family and love, and then turned to Martin and me. And of course, thank you to Mr. and Mrs. Devlin for hosting this. You two are such an inspiring couple. Everyone clapped. I smiled, even though I felt that all too familiar knot tighten in my stomach. Martin raised his glass and chuckled. Well, if Jenna turns out half as smart as her mother, and hopefully twice as sane, I'll consider that a win. There was laughter. Not uproarious, but just enough to sting. A few chuckles. And an awkward giggle from Tina. Yes, that Tina. His friend from work who had been invited as a guest of a guest. She stood behind him, holding a mimosa and wearing the same shade of lipstick I used to wear. I froze. It wasn't the words that hurt the most. It was the ease with which he said them. The practiced sarcasm. The performance of it all. I was just another character in his story, the uptight wife, the overly sensitive homemaker who should be grateful just to be acknowledged. I caught Harper's eye. She looked away. And then I did something I didn't expect of myself. I excused myself from the table and walked back into the house. Not dramatically. Not with tears or accusations. But quietly. Methodically. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of our bed, and stared at my reflection in the vanity mirror. My lipstick had faded. A wisp of hair had come undone. I looked tired. Older than I remembered. Downstairs, they laughed without me. The music played on. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt something shift deep inside. Not rage. Not sorrow. Something colder. Clearer. Like the sudden snap of a branch in winter. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and Martin was watching TV in the living room with a glass of scotch, I asked him calmly, "Why did you say that today? In front of everyone?" He barely looked up. "It was a joke, Leona. You need to stop taking everything so personally." That phrase again. So personally. I nodded. That night, I slept in the guest room. I told him I had a headache. He didn't ask questions. Didn't come to check on me. He was already gone. Just not officially. What I didn't realize then was that this moment, this small act of public cruelty dressed in laughter, would be the turning point. The line I couldn't unsee. The joke they all laughed at, but I couldn't forget. It was the moment I realized the man I had built a life with no longer respected me and hadn't for a long, long time. It didn't end with a fight. It ended with silence. And the day Martin asked me to leave, or rather, suggested it, as he put it, was ordinary in every other way. The sky was clear, the coffee had brewed on time, the dog next door barked like always. I was folding laundry, humming to myself, when he came into the room and said it as casually as one might mention running out of milk. "I think it would be better for both of us if we had some space." I froze, holding one of his pressed shirts in my hands. My heart didn't break in that moment, not because it wasn't painful, but because something in me had already prepared for it. Like I'd spent the last year subconsciously bracing for impact. Still, hearing the words spoken aloud was like swallowing glass. "Space," I repeated. "You want me to move out?" He shrugged. "It doesn't have to be dramatic, Leona. We're clearly in different places. We're not connecting anymore. We've been living separate lives for a while now." Separate lives. He didn't say he loved someone else, though I knew. He didn't say her name, but I could smell her perfume sometimes on his coat, a cheap vanilla musk I would never wear. He didn't offer any regret or even anger. Just attachment. Cold efficiency. Like ending a lease agreement. The girls weren't home. Jenna had recently moved in with Daniel, and Harper was away at college. There was no one to witness the moment my marriage officially dissolved. No audience to plead with, no daughters to explain it to. It was just us in the house we built, surrounded by pieces of a life we both stopped tending to. I nodded slowly. Okay, that was all I said. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't scream or throw anything. The calmness surprised even me. But after years of being ignored, overlooked, and slowly erased, I didn't have the energy to perform heartbreak for someone who had already stopped seeing me. In the following days, I packed my things carefully. Not because I planned to take much, but because I refused to leave in chaos. I boxed up photo albums, my mother's cookbook, my easel, and paintbrushes. I left behind the wedding album, the crystal vases from our anniversaries, and the expensive cookware I never got to use for family holidays that never came. When I told the girls, their reactions were split. Jenna, ever her father's daughter, seemed unsurprised. "Are you sure this is the best thing, Mom?" she asked. "You always seemed frustrated." Frustrated. As if my grief had been a mood. Harper cried. She said she never saw it coming, that she thought we were just going through a rough patch. I didn't correct her. It wasn't her fault she missed the signs. Her father had always been good at disguising absence as busyness. Within a week, I signed a lease on a modest condo in Savannah. It was nothing like our Charleston home. Smaller. Quieter. With outdated carpet and peeling wallpaper in the hallway. But it was mine. And for the first time in decades, the silence that followed me wasn't heavy with disappointment. It was clean. Untouched. There were days I lay on the couch and stared at the ceiling, wondering what all those years had meant. If I had wasted my best decades loving someone who never really loved me back. If I'd stayed too long out of duty, or fear, or hope that the man I married would return. And there were other days I felt something stirring beneath the grief. Not joy, not yet. But space. Space to breathe. To think. To remember who I had been before my life became an extension of someone else's ambition. I didn't tell many people what happened. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want to justify my choice to those who had never asked about my pain to begin with. Let them think I walked away on a whim. Let them believe I was too sensitive, too cold, too complicated. The truth was simple. I left because staying had become another way of disappearing. And I wasn't ready to vanish. It's strange how rock bottom doesn't always look like a dramatic fall. Sometimes, it's a quiet place. A lonely grocery aisle where no one notices you crying next to a can of soup. A cold kitchen with only one coffee mug in the drying rack. A voicemail that never gets returned. That's where I lived for the first 6 months after leaving Martin. The condo in Savannah was small, just 2 bedrooms and an old radiator that clanged like a rusty bell at night. It was the kind of place where the pipes groaned louder than your thoughts, and still, the silence found a way in. I decorated it with what little I brought, A few framed photos of the girls when they were young, some secondhand furniture, and a small collection of ceramic birds I picked up at a thrift store, just to keep the shelves from looking so empty. But nothing filled the space between my ribs. Waking up was the hardest part. I'd open my eyes and forget for a second that I was alone. I'd reach across the bed to touch the cool, empty sheets where Martin used to be. Even in those final years, when he barely looked at me, the absence still had weight. And when reality sank in, it didn't hit like a punch. It leaked in like water through a cracked ceiling. Slow. Relentless. The girls called occasionally, mostly Harper. Jenna's calls were brief and hollow check-ins, just to fulfill obligation. Just wanted to see how you're settling in, Mom. I'd lie and say everything was fine. That I was loving the freedom. That I'd started painting again. None of that was true. Yet, I took a part-time job as a receptionist at a dental clinic downtown. The pay wasn't great, but it kept me from sinking entirely. I filed patient charts, scheduled cleanings, and smiled like I had a reason to. The other women were polite, but I didn't make friends. I felt old around them, not because of my age, but because of the grief I carried like an invisible backpack. It made me heavy in a way they didn't understand. There were nights I didn't eat. Nights I fell asleep on the couch with the TV playing reruns, just to avoid walking past the empty bedroom. Nights I opened old albums and ran my fingers over the edges of pictures that had once meant something. A Christmas morning, a school play, Martin and I on our honeymoon. We looked happy. Maybe we were. Or maybe I just didn't know any better. The hardest day came when I ran into Martin's photo online. I was scrolling through a local news site during my lunch break when his face popped up on the screen. Devlin and Marsh Realty sponsors annual charity gala. There he was, arm around Tina, both of them smiling like a political couple. She was wearing the same lipstick again, that artificial pink that looked like melted candy. And there, standing beside them, were Jenna and Harper. It was like being erased in real time. They had taken a new family photo without me. A glossy, public image that told the world, we are complete. We are happy. We've moved on. I barely made it to the clinic bathroom before I broke down. I sat on the floor of that stall, knees pulled to my chest, and wept into my sleeves. I wasn't crying because I missed Martin. I was crying because I realized no one else did. No one seemed to notice I was gone. I had built my life around other people's needs, and when I stopped serving that role, I simply disappeared. I wish I could say that moment gave me clarity, that I wiped my tears and vowed to rise from the ashes like a phoenix. But that's not how it works. Not at first. Instead, I went home, curled up under a thrifted quilt, and whispered, "You're still here," over and over, as if reminding myself I hadn't died with the marriage. Rock bottom wasn't a bang. It was a long, low echo that made me question if I had ever truly existed outside of what I gave to others. But sometimes, when you're buried that deep, you start to feel the ground under your feet again. And that, I would come to learn, was the beginning of something I hadn't felt in years: stillness. And in stillness, things begin to grow. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day where nothing feels particularly important, the kind of day you expect to forget. I had taken the afternoon off from the dental clinic to sort through some old boxes in the condo storage closet. Not because I had plans for them, but because clutter had begun to suffocate me in ways I couldn't explain. I needed to see what I was still carrying, literally and otherwise. The boxes were labeled in faded marker, kitchen, photos, Leona's studio. And one that simply said, Ray. That one stopped me. My brother, Raymond, or Ray, had passed away the previous year from a heart attack. He was the only family member who truly checked in on me during the divorce. While everyone else politely looked away, Ray asked real questions, listened without judgment. When Martin left, Ray had shown up with groceries, wine, and a single sentence that still rang in my head: "You were always more than just his wife." I pulled the box down and carried it to the dining table. It was filled mostly with tools, a few flannel shirts, and some sketches of a woodworking project he'd never finished. I reached the bottom and noticed a yellow envelope, slightly bent, with my name written in his handwriting: "Leona, read when you're ready." My heart pounded. I hesitated before opening it, holding it like it might shatter. Inside was a short letter from Ray, and beneath it, a folded piece of paper that looked older, creased from multiple openings. I read Ray's note first. "Sis, I found this while cleaning out the house after your divorce. I wasn't sure when to give it to you. You looked so broken then, I didn't want to make it worse. But I also knew this wasn't mine to keep. You deserve the truth. All of it. Ray." I unfolded the second sheet. It was a letter from Martin. It wasn't addressed or stamped, never mailed. Maybe it was something he had written and never had the courage to send. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still sharp. I read it slowly, my eyes trembling over each line. "Leona, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to say it out loud. I've done a lot of things I can't take back, but leaving you the way I did is the one thing that keeps me awake at night. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I hated the man I had become, and you reminded me of who I used to be. You never asked for anything, and still I made you carry everything. You gave me a home, 2 beautiful daughters, and a life I didn't deserve. And I repaid you with silence, with absence, with shame. Tina didn't save me. She just didn't know me well enough to see how far I had fallen. You did, and that scared me. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that you were never the problem. You were always the best part of my life." I sat in silence, the letter resting on the table like a confession from a ghost. My eyes welled, but I didn't cry right away. I just stared out the window at the gray sky, watching the wind bend the trees. Somewhere deep in my chest, something cracked open. All these years, I thought I had been the invisible one, the disposable one, the woman who got left behind because she wasn't enough. And here he was, finally admitting what I had suspected but never dared to believe. It wasn't me. It had never been me. I held that letter like it was a fragile artifact from another life, because it was. It didn't change the past. It didn't fix the scars. But it gave shape to a truth I could carry forward, a truth that wasn't tainted by gaslighting or mockery or silence. I placed the letter in a small wooden frame and set it on my bookshelf, not because I wanted to honor Martin, but because I needed a marker. A line in the sand that said, "This is where the story begins to change." Later that night, I picked up a paintbrush for the first time in years. Not to impress anyone. Not to be good at it. Just to feel something move through me that was mine and mine alone. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was becoming someone again. Something shifted after I found that letter. Not all at once, mind you. I didn't leap out of bed the next morning with new purpose or suddenly glow with clarity. But piece by piece, I started seeing things differently. The fog that had wrapped itself around my life for so long began to lift, not in dramatic gusts, but in slow, quiet wisps. I began waking up earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel the stillness of the morning. I'd open the windows, breathe in the salty savanna air, and just listen to the birds, to the traffic, to myself. The silence that once haunted me now felt like space. Space to grow, to think, to reclaim the parts of me that had been buried beneath years of being his wife, their mother, the quiet one in the background. That framed letter sat on my bookshelf, not as a monument to Martin's regret, but as a reminder that I had not imagined my worth. It was always there. He simply failed to recognize it until it was too late. And now that I had it in writing, now that I had proof that my love hadn't been foolish or wasted, something inside me hardened. Not bitterly, but firmly. A foundation was being rebuilt. I started journaling again. The words came slow at first, clumsy even, but eventually poured out in long, unfiltered streams. I wrote about my childhood, my marriage, my girls, and the little pieces of joy I had once claimed as mine before they were forgotten. It was in those pages that I began to remember myself, not as someone trying to survive, but as someone ready to begin. I stopped coloring my hair. That may sound trivial, but for me, it was liberation. For decades, I'd sat in salons erasing the gray, chasing youth for a man who was now buried in the same suit he wore to court me. I let the silver show, and to my surprise, I liked it. It didn't make me look older, it made me look real. Honest. Unhidden. On weekends, I returned to the art studio at the community center where I once volunteered. The first day I walked in, the scent of paint and clay nearly brought me to tears. I hadn't realized how much I missed the messiness, the trial and error, the act of creating something that didn't need to be perfect, just mine. I started teaching a small watercolor class for women over 50. Most of them came not to become great artists, but to feel like they mattered, to feel seen. We laughed a lot, cried sometimes, shared stories in between brush strokes, and in their company, I remembered what it meant to belong. I also started saying no. A lot. No to Jenna when she called asking if I'd come visit, but made it clear Tina would be there too. No to Harper when she tried to play peacekeeper, gently encouraging me to be more civil with their father's memory. No to old friends who only wanted to hear the gossip, not the truth. Boundaries became my armor. Not walls to keep people out, but gates I controlled. Who entered, who stayed, and who no longer had access to me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt in the same way either. There was a new feeling blooming beneath my ribs, something softer, deeper. Power. Not the kind that comes from revenge or recognition, but the kind that comes from surviving, from knowing exactly who you are after everything that tried to erase you failed. One morning, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and said out loud, "You're still here." And for the first time, I believed it. I wasn't defined by what Martin did or didn't give me. I wasn't the woman they pitted, whispered about, or overlooked. I was Leona Markham. 62. Silver-haired. Paint-stained. Unbroken. And I was just getting started. After the awakening came stillness. Not the same lonely stillness I'd known in the condo months before, but a new kind. Focused. Intentional. A stillness with purpose. I didn't tell anyone what I had found in the letter. Not my daughters, not even the few friends I had reconnected with from the art center. That letter from Martin was mine, and I didn't want to spend the next chapter of my life interpreting his guilt or giving anyone the chance to minimize it. Instead, I started planning. Not for revenge. Not for recognition. But for ownership. Of my life. Of my time. Of what I had quietly given up for decades and now felt ready to reclaim. It began with paperwork. I dusted off my old folders, pulled out every legal and financial document I had, and started reviewing them one by one. Bank accounts, insurance policies, joint assets that hadn't fully transferred after the divorce. Things I once avoided because they felt too heavy or too hopeless. This time, I tackled them like a woman with a flashlight in a dark tunnel. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was awake. I reached out to an old friend of Ray's, Dean Holloway, a retired estate lawyer who used to fish with my brother on weekends. Dean remembered me instantly. "Ray always said you had more grit than anyone he knew," he told me, pouring us coffee across his kitchen table. I smiled, remembering how Ray used to call me the strong one, even when I didn't believe him. Dean helped me quietly review what remained of Martin's estate. To my surprise and, frankly, confusion, there were several sealed documents still in legal limbo due to changes Martin had made to his will shortly before his death. Tina had filed to contest them, but certain provisions were protected. Dean explained that Martin had created a trust in my name 6 months before he passed, under a different legal entity. Most people wouldn't have noticed it unless they knew what to look for. "Why would he do that?" I asked. Dean paused. "I think he was trying to do right by you in the only way he knew how." Quietly. And a little too late. It wasn't validation. It didn't erase what he'd done. But it gave me leverage. Not for power over anyone else, but for power over myself. Financially. Legally. Emotionally. I used the funds to settle into a slightly larger apartment. Still modest, still mine. I donated half of my old clothes, sold the jewelry Martin had given me, pieces that had grown cold on my skin, and kept only one item, the wedding band I no longer wore. I placed it in a small wooden box along with Ray's letter and Martin's confession. A time capsule of closure. I started taking walks every morning before sunrise. The world felt untouched at that hour, unbothered. It gave me time to think clearly, to plan, to let go, to breathe. It was during those walks that I made quiet decisions, to leave the past where it belonged, to stop trying to repair relationships that only reached out when they needed something, to build something entirely new. I enrolled in a community leadership course, something I'd always wanted to do when the girls were young, but Martin said was a waste of time. The first week, I introduced myself not as a divorcee or a mother or a widow. I simply said, I'm Leona. I teach art. I'm learning how to rebuild. And it felt true. I didn't post anything on social media. I didn't update the girls on every little change. I didn't tell Tina or Martin's former friends or the neighbors from Charleston who still sent me the occasional awkward holiday card. I let the silence do the work. That's the thing no one tells you about healing. Sometimes the loudest kind of power is the kind that makes no sound at all. No announcements. No warnings. Just slow, deliberate steps in a direction no one saw coming. By the time Martin's estate was fully settled and his will scheduled for final reading, I had made peace with the fact that I didn't need anything from him. And yet, I had the distinct feeling that what came next would turn more heads than anything he ever gave me when he was alive. They didn't notice the shift at first, and that was exactly how I wanted it. From the outside, I was still Leona Markham, the quiet ex-wife who had disappeared after the divorce, the woman whose name hadn't been spoken much in the last few years. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't demanded anything. I hadn't even attended Martin's retirement party, though I was invited, likely out of obligation. I was invisible to most of them, and they had grown comfortable with that. But slowly, that comfort began to crack. It started with the calls from Martin's legal team, or more specifically, the executor of his estate, a man named Thomas Greer who had been Martin's personal attorney for nearly 20 years. He reached out to me politely, but with growing urgency. Apparently, Martin had made several last-minute amendments to his will, and due to the complexity of the trust accounts involved, some of which were in my name, I was legally required to attend the final reading. I agreed, saying little. What Thomas didn't realize was that I already knew the contents of the trust. Dean had helped me review the paperwork weeks earlier. I knew about the Charleston house, the one Martin and I had bought together before he signed it over to Tina after the divorce. I knew about the sizable art fund that Martin had named after me, a tribute, according to the documentation, to the creative spirit who made a home out of struggle. I even knew that he had written explicit instructions that the provisions for Tina and the girls were not to override my rights to those specific assets. None of them knew. And that was the shift. Power had returned to me, not as a weapon, but as quiet knowledge. I didn't need to argue or fight. I had truth and time on my side. The second sign came from Jenna. She called one evening, her tone softer than it had been in years. Hey, Mom. Just checking in. I heard from Dad's lawyer that you're going to the will reading. I could hear it, that hesitation in her voice, that faint undercurrent of confusion. For so long, they'd believed the narrative that Tina and Martin had fed them, that I had been distant, cold, too emotional to keep the family together. But now, things weren't lining up. Yes, I'll be there, I replied simply. Silence. Then, okay. I just wasn't expecting that. I wasn't expecting a lot of things, Jenna. It wasn't spiteful. It was just true. The next shift came with Tina. I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, which surprised me. It was brief, defensive in tone, cloaked in civility. Leona, I'm sure this has all been overwhelming for you. I want to make it clear that whatever arrangements Martin made were his decision. I hope we can all behave appropriately at the reading and avoid unnecessary tension. Tina. Behave appropriately? The same woman who once stood at my husband's funeral with her hand on his chest like a trophy was now asking me to be civil. It almost made me laugh. Instead, I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer. Not out of pettiness, but as a reminder of how quickly certainty can become insecurity. Behind the scenes, words started spreading. I heard from a former neighbor, Marjorie, who texted me out of the blue. I heard you might be inheriting the Charleston house. Good for you, Leona. No one deserved it more. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly remembered my number. Polite inquiries wrapped in nosiness. Offers to catch up that were thinly veiled questions about the estate. That's the thing about quiet women. They don't stay invisible forever, especially not when the structure that erased them begins to collapse. By the time the will reading was formally scheduled, I had gathered my composure like a perfectly tailored coat. I would walk into that room not to take anything from anyone, but to reclaim what had always been mine. I didn't want applause. I didn't want drama. I wanted the truth to be heard out loud, in front of everyone who had spent years whispering behind my back. And whether they liked it or not, they were going to listen. The room was smaller than I expected, a modest conference room at the law offices of Greer and Holloway, with beige carpeting, stiff leather chairs, and a long oval table polished to a dull shine. It smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and old paper. There was no drama, no grand oak-paneled hall, just an air of controlled tension that settled over the room like dust. When I walked in, no one stood. No one greeted me. Tina sat at the head of the table, her lips drawn in a tight line, wearing a black blazer like armor. Jenna was beside her, flipping through her phone but not really looking at it, and Harper sat off to the side, hands clasped in her lap, eyes darting toward me and then away again. I took a seat across from them without a word, placing my purse gently on the floor. My spine was straight. My hands were still. Thomas Greer entered next, carrying a thick folder. "Good afternoon," he said to the room, setting his materials down. "Thank you for coming. As you all know, this is the final reading of Martin Devlin's last will and testament." I watched Tina carefully. Her nails tapped against the table in a steady rhythm, controlled but restless. She hadn't expected me to come, I could tell. Maybe she thought I'd forfeit it all to avoid discomfort, the way I had always swallowed my pain before. But today wasn't for her comfort. Thomas began reading through the standard preamble, legal formalities, statements of sound mind, the revocation of any prior wills. I could feel everyone else shifting in their seats, growing impatient, waiting for the part they came for. Then came the turn. In accordance with the decedent's final amendment, dated June 17th, the following assets are to be distributed as outlined to Miss Leona Markham, the Charleston property located at 1826 Wexford Lane, fully deeded with no liens. The estate's remaining mortgage was paid in full by the decedent prior to his passing. Gasps. Audible ones. Jenna blinked. Harper's mouth opened slightly. Tina's face didn't move, but her knuckles turned white. Thomas continued. Additionally, to Miss Markham, the Martin Devlin Creative Arts Fund, established to support underrepresented women over the age of 50 in pursuit of artistic careers, is to be managed in her name. This fund, valued at $480,000, is non-transferable and not subject to contest. Tina's voice cracked like ice. There must be a mistake. Thomas didn't even blink. All documents are valid and were notarized. The trust was reviewed by our office and the probate court. Silence swept the room like a tide, pulling everything under. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. But then Thomas pulled out a letter, not from the will, but a personal note. The decedent also left a statement addressed to the room. "With your permission, I'd like to read it." No one objected. He unfolded the paper and read aloud, "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. And if Leona is in the room, it means she's stronger than I ever gave her credit for, though I always knew it. To those who may be surprised by what I've done, understand this. I made choices in my life that I regret. I left behind someone who built me, who believed in me long before I believed in myself. Tina, I thank you for being there in my final years, but you came into my story after the foundation had already been laid. Jenna, Harper, your mother gave up more than either of you will ever fully understand. If you're angry today, I ask you to sit with that anger and then look at the woman sitting across from you. She deserves everything I couldn't give her when it mattered. I hope this gives her back some of what I took." Thomas folded the letter and placed it back in the file. The room stayed still. No one moved. Even the air seemed to pause. I looked at my daughters, one teetering on defensiveness, the other overwhelmed by guilt. I didn't gloat. I didn't cry. I simply said, I didn't come for a fight. I came to close a chapter one never got to finish. Tina stood abruptly, gathering her things without a word. She exited quickly, heels clicking down the hall like a retreating army. Jenna stared after her. Harper finally looked at me, really looked at me, and gave the smallest nod. I stood, thanked Thomas quietly, and walked out. The story had finally been told. Not by me, but by the man who once tried to silence me. And now there was nothing left to prove. I thought the final reading of the will would be the end of it. The truth had been spoken. Martin had, in his own last breath, made amends or tried to. I had walked out of that law office with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in decades. But justice has a strange way of lingering, like the echo of a bell long after it's rung. And sometimes, the final blow comes when no one sees it coming. Not even you. A week after the reading, I returned to the Charleston house. I hadn't stepped foot in it since the day I left it, 10 years earlier, suitcase in one hand, dignity in the other. The key turned easily. Inside, everything looked smaller than I remembered. The furniture had changed, the curtains were different, but the bones of the place, the hardwood floors, the molding we had painted ourselves, the tiny scuff marks on the baseboards from Harper's roller skates, were exactly the same. I walked through the house slowly, taking it in as if it were a museum of a life that had once belonged to someone else. On the mantel sat a photo of Martin and Tina at some charity gala. It was in a silver frame. She was wearing pearls. He looked tired. I took it down, not out of spite, but because it didn't belong anymore. This house, once a symbol of my silence, was mine again. Not as a consolation prize, but as something I had built, lost, and reclaimed on my own terms. The next morning, I received a call from Dean Holloway. "You might want to sit down for this," he said. Tina had attempted to file an emergency injunction to block the transfer of the trust fund, claiming emotional duress, undue influence, and that I had manipulated Martin in his final days. It was baseless, desperate, and more importantly, it had failed. The court had dismissed her petition in less than 24 hours, citing clear documentation, multiple notarized confirmations, and statements from Martin's physician declaring him of sound mind at the time of the changes. But that wasn't the twist. Dean continued. During the review, the court uncovered something else. An account Martin had set up in Jenna and Harper's name, scheduled to release at the time of his death. It's held up now, frozen. Why? I asked, confused. Because it was funded by a portfolio that included assets he never disclosed in the divorce settlement. Assets that legally should have been divided, which means, Leona, they technically belong to you. I sat there stunned. Martin had hidden assets. Stocks, property shares, and a small investment firm he had opened in a partner's name to keep off the books. He'd moved the profits quietly, funneling them into accounts meant for his daughters, but only after ensuring Tina would never see a dime of it. It was all buried so deep that even his primary estate attorney hadn't known until the probate court flagged inconsistencies. What does that mean? I asked. It means you're entitled to claim them. Not just the trust or the house, but the full portfolio. Estimated value? Dean hesitated. About $1,300,000. It was surreal. Not because of the money, but because of what it meant. For years, I believed I'd left with nothing. I'd accepted it. I'd made peace with building a life from scratch. But now, I stood at the center of a narrative I didn't write, where the man who once walked out on me had, through greed or guilt, left me the keys to a kingdom he thought I would never touch again. I didn't gloat. I didn't run to my daughters and shout, "I told you so." Instead, I requested that a portion of the funds be redirected into scholarships under Ray's name. Quietly, without fanfare. I kept the rest. Not as revenge, but as repair. Not to relive what was lost, but to live differently going forward. Tina never called. She packed up and moved out of Charleston within the month. Jenna sent a text, "I don't know what to say. I didn't know any of this." I replied, "I know you didn't. I'm not angry anymore." Because I wasn't. The final justice wasn't in the money or the victory. It was in the restoration of my voice, my worth, and the undeniable fact that I had never been the one who was lost. They just finally saw what had been true all along. A few weeks after the court ruling, I was in the Charleston house, barefoot in the garden, pruning what was left of the hydrangeas I had planted nearly 20 years ago. They were stubborn, wilted, but not dead. Much like me, I suppose. With time, water, and attention, even the most forgotten things can bloom again. That's when Harper showed up. I heard her car door close before I saw her. She didn't call first, didn't text, just drove up and parked in the driveway like she used to after school, when she still lived here and needed to talk to Mom about something too big to say over the phone. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the side gate. She was standing there, arms crossed, a little lost. "Hey," she said quietly. "Hey," I replied. My voice didn't shake. I didn't rush toward her. I didn't fold her into a hug. I simply waited. "I was hoping we could talk," she said. "I know I should have come sooner." I nodded, motioning toward the porch. "Let's sit." We settled onto the old wicker bench Martin and I once picked out at a flea market. The cushions sagged a little, but it held. Harper looked thinner, more tired than the last time I'd seen her. Her makeup was minimal. She had her father's eyes, but today they didn't hold the same certainty. They looked searching. "I didn't know everything, Mom," she said, her voice cracking just slightly. "Not about the will, or what Dad left you, or the way things really ended." "I know," I said gently. "You weren't supposed to." She looked at me startled. "What do you mean?" "You were a child, Harper. Even when you thought you were old enough to understand, you were still being fed a version of the truth by people who needed to protect their side of it." She lowered her eyes. "I believed him. I believed Tina. I thought you just gave up." That part stung, but I let it pass. I had made peace with the fact that in order for them to accept Tina, they had needed to rewrite me as someone disposable. It wasn't personal, it was survival. And now they were waking up to the truth in pieces. Harper picked at her sleeve, then asked the question she'd clearly been carrying for a while. "Why didn't you ever tell us your side?" I looked out over the garden. "Because you wouldn't have heard me then. And I didn't want to be the mother who turned her children into weapons. I didn't want you to feel like you had to choose." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I'm sorry for not asking. For not being there when you needed me." I reached out and placed my hand over hers. It was smaller than I remembered, softer. "I needed to be there for myself first," I said. And I was. That's why I'm still standing. She laughed softly through her tears. "You're more than standing. You're thriving." I smiled, but said nothing. I didn't need validation. I didn't need the apology. Her being here, genuinely here, was enough. "I don't know if Jenna will come around," she said after a while. "She's proud and angry. She feels like Dad lied to her, and she doesn't know where to put that." "She'll figure it out," I said. "Or she won't. But that's hers to carry, not mine." We sat for a long time, letting the silence stretch without tension. Harper told me about her job, her new apartment, a relationship she was unsure about. I listened, not as someone desperate to be included again, but as someone who had finally found comfort in her own skin. As the sun dipped lower, Harper looked at me and asked, "Can I come by again sometime? Just to visit? Maybe even paint with you?" "Of course," I said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "But this time, I'll let you do the talking." She smiled. Deal. It wasn't a fairy tale reunion. There were no violins playing, no sweeping embraces, no Instagram-worthy selfies of mother and daughter healing in golden hour light. But it was real. And real was more than enough. As she pulled out of the driveway, I stood in the doorway, hand resting against the frame, and realized something quietly powerful. I no longer needed my daughters to understand my story to feel whole. They were welcome in my life, but I didn't need their approval to live it. It was a Sunday morning when I finally allowed myself to be still. Not out of exhaustion or emptiness, but out of peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't arrive in a single moment, but accumulates quietly after months of steady choices. The sun filtered through the lace curtains in my new reading room, a small, sunlit corner I'd converted from the old guest bedroom in the Charleston house. I had painted the walls a soft sage green, hung a few of my own watercolor pieces, and placed a cozy armchair near the window. A record played faint jazz in the background, and on my lap was a steaming cup of black tea. No phone. No TV. Just the world as it was, humming gently outside my window. On the side table sat three things: the framed letter from Martin, a photo of Ray holding a fish he once bragged was bigger than it was, and a leather-bound journal, nearly filled now, where I had written every detail of this strange, painful, and ultimately liberating chapter of my life. It's funny how healing doesn't make everything disappear. The scars are still there. I still remember the sound of Martin's voice dismissing me, the hollow ache of being forgotten by my own children, the crushing quiet of that first night alone in Savannah. But now those memories feel like old photographs. Still real, still part of my story, but no longer able to hurt me. I walked into this house 10 years ago as a wife trying to keep a family together. I walked out of it stripped down to nothing but survival. And now I had returned. Not to reclaim what was lost, but to honor the woman who made it through. There was no revenge in my heart, no bitterness, just gratitude for the truth, even if it came late. Martin didn't get to watch me rise, but maybe that's how it was meant to be. His last gesture wasn't redemption, it was confession. And that confession gave me back the space I'd been denied. I had used a portion of the inheritance to launch the Ray Markham Scholarship for creative women over 50, something that still makes me smile when I think of the look on the first recipient's face. I imagined Ray rolling his eyes, muttering something about all that sentimental crap, even as he beamed with pride. The rest I used to build something quiet and sustainable, a life that wasn't flashy, but full. I taught art 3 times a week at the community center. I held workshops in the Charleston house on weekends. Sometimes 10 women came, sometimes only 2, but each one brought a story, and together we turned pain into pigment, silence into expression. Jenna hadn't called. I didn't expect her to. Some people need longer to rewrite the stories they were told. Some never do. But that was no longer my burden. Harper visited every other weekend. We painted together. We talked about life. We shared long walks down the same streets where she once rode her bike in pigtails. She never said the words, "I'm sorry" again. And she didn't have to. Her presence was apology enough. One evening after class, I stayed behind in the art studio. The other women had gone home, and the building was bathed in golden light. I stood in front of a large, blank canvas, the kind that used to intimidate me, but now it excited me. It was a reminder of what was still possible. I dipped my brush into cerulean blue and began to paint, without thinking. Broad strokes. Unapologetic color. No outlines. No fear. It wasn't meant for display. It wasn't meant for anyone's approval. It was for me. The woman who once gave everything and asked for nothing. The woman who was left behind and built a world from what remained. The woman who finally saw herself. As the last of the light faded, I stepped back from the canvas. The painting wasn't finished, but it didn't need to be. Neither was I. And in that moment, surrounded by silence, strength, and the scent of turpentine, I understood the lesson I'd waited a lifetime to learn. You don't need justice to heal. You just need to remember who you are.